Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this month's RSA Webinar, this time on science denialism. My name is Dr. Meredith Doig. I'm President of the Rationalist Society of Australia, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. And before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join us in acknowledging the custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and to sea and to community. So tonight, it's a real pleasure to welcome Lucy Richardson from the Monash Climate Change Communication Research Hub. Now, Lucy's research focuses on understanding Australian climate change audiences and the messaging, the way that they respond to messages about climate change, and how the media represents topics relating to climate change. So her broader research interests really encompass environmental science and communication and social psychology generally, and how those all intersect into a whole. And at Monash, she teaches a unit which is called Climate Change Communication. Now, as usual, for those of you who've been with us before, Lucy will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll head into Q&A in the second part of the webinar. And again, as usual, I invite you, if you do have questions during the webinar that occur to you, then just open up the chat box, type your questions in there, and I'll make sure that we get through as many of them as possible before the 8:30 cutoff mark. We already have, thank you for those people who've already sent in some questions. So without further ado, Lucy, may I invite you to present your talk, and then in the second half, we'll go into some Q&A. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Great to see everybody coming on board here. As Meredith said, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash. My original background was actually environmental engineering, and I worked in consulting and nonprofit sector, and eventually working in the environmental nonprofit sector, I came to realise that environmental issues are not so much about the environment as they are about people. And so I became fascinated by psychology and studied that. And so now I'm kind of blending those environmental aspects with the psychology and in the context at the moment of climate change, to see how we can better communicate climate change for encouraging action. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a particular project that we undertook, which happened at the nexus of climate change and COVID, which kind of seems like a weird space to play, but I'll give you a bit of a background on the project that kind of explains hopefully how we came to look at those two together. We were actually approached by some colleagues who at the time, he was based in Auckland in New Zealand, and he'd done a similar study over there. They were quite interested in the COVID recovery context, looking at a green recovery and people's attitudes to that as a way to help us understand messaging options for how to promote that kind of a green recovery approach, green economic recovery from post-COVID. And also they were interested in COVID vaccinations and people's attitudes to that, and how we could sort of improve communication around that to promote uptake of those vaccines. So as we were connecting the concepts in terms of that green recovery, throwing in COVID questions at the same time, when we went through, we did the study in 2021, and it was done at a time when the COVID vaccines were sort of still relatively early in their rollout. So most of the people who were getting the vaccines were older people and those who were already had compromised health. So we're still pretty early on. And we did a survey of just over 1,000 Australians, and we used representative quotas to try and get, that breadth across age and gender, et cetera, to try and get a bit of a good representation about what Australians might be thinking. And what we did with that was part of his project. We actually did audience segmentation. if you haven't come across that before, it's a technique that has come across, so in traditional marketing, so that's marketing for shareholder profit, they use an approach of targeting their messages to audiences to get maximum buy-in, maximum profit. In social marketing, they took that kind of concept, but they apply it to marketing for social good. So it's actually about community benefit, not private benefit. And so they took that approach. So in order to target messages to populations or subpopulations, we do a process called segmentation. And so what we do is we take a series of survey questions and people's responses to that, and we use a statistical analysis to group them into like-minded subsets, so groups that think more alike and more differently from each other, so that we can actually understand how that kind of like-minded group might respond into different messages in different situations. And so that's what we did here. And we did two separate segmentations. So one based on questions around climate change, and the other based on questions around people's attitudes and intentions relating to the COVID vaccines. So we ended up with these two unique sets of segmentation. And I'll explain what those are in a little bit. So I'll just bring up a slide just to show you what we found. So on the left, we have our COVID-19 vaccine segments, and on the right, we have our climate change segments, and I'll go through and explain what those are. So when we did the COVID questions, we had a series of questions in there relating to people's attitudes towards the vaccine. So are they good, bad? Are they helpful, not helpful? Are they dangerous, not dangerous, etc.? We asked them about their social norms. So social norms are a form of social pressure. So it's the expectations that are placed on us by other people of what is appropriate behaviour. And then we also included questions around people's perceived control over the behaviour. Did they think they could actually get it when it came through? Did they understand what they needed to do? So we used those questions, and we came through that statistical analysis. We came up with 5 different segments. So the darkest purple here are the enthusiast segment. That segment had the most favourable attitudes toward the vaccines. They had strong social norms about vaccination against COVID, and almost all of them said they would definitely get a vaccine to protect themselves. The next group, that mid-blue, the mid-purple, were called supporters. So these group also were had favourable attitudes to the vaccine, strong social norms towards vaccination, but significantly less than that of the enthusiasts. The lightest purple there is a group called the socials. So these have lower but still favourable attitudes, lower norms, and intentions to get the vaccine, but they were wanting to get the vaccine to protect other people. So they were doing it for social reasons rather than for personal protection. Then that light red, that kind of pinkish colour, that's the hesitant group. So that was a group that had, again, quite low attitudes, favourability of the attitudes towards the vaccines, very weak social norms for vaccination. And the majority of them actually said they're unsure but leaning towards no regarding getting a vaccine to protect either themselves or other people. And the last group we had, that dark red, is the group that were labelled as the skeptics. So they had the least favourable attitudes to the vaccines, very few social pressures towards getting vaccinated, and overwhelmingly said that they would definitely not get a vaccine to protect themselves or other people. And you can see that's actually quite a small segment. That was about 10%. And so you think in the context of the vaccines, we wanted to hit that 90% herd immunity kind of uptake of the vaccines. And that was the group, that 10% would be the group who stuck to their guns, so to speak. They were just never gonna make it happen.
Lucy, can I just ask, did you have any idea whether that 10% changed over time, or was this just a simple snapshot?
No, we did do a second wave of the survey, but because of the change in time, by the time the second one happened, we already had a large number of people who had received their first vaccination. And we did ask people why, though, and a lot of them got it because they just wanted to get back to normal. So it wasn't necessarily that they were worried about COVID or anything like that. But yeah, so in terms of doing this segmentation, it was a one-time thing because the nature of people's responses to those questions would change over time as those things happen. And so you couldn't really ask people, would you get your first vaccine when they've already had one? So from that perspective, that particular segmentation approach wouldn't work. You'd have to redo it with new questions to make it appropriate. So it's not really comparable. So that's the COVID segments. When it comes to the climate change segments, this uses an approach that's actually been rolled out across countries all over the world now. It was developed originally in the US, and it comes up with these 6 segments, ranging from the group that they're termed alarmed, all the way around to the group that are called dismissive. And if you think of those as 2 ends of a spectrum, those two, the people in those 2 segments have the highest confidence in their attitudes regarding the science. So they are relatively engaged. They're kind of the most engaged groups, but on polar opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of their attitudes to the science, positive or negative acceptance of that science. In between that, you can see there's a bit more of a spectrum. So the alarm segment, as I said, most worried about climate change, the most active politically and personally, privately, and civically, I guess you could say. Then we have the concern segment, the next level down. This group has historically been the biggest group. So they're less politically active, less personally active, but still really worried. Then you get the cautious group. These are kind of a fence sitter. So I'm not quite sure, but I'm leaning toward, yes, climate change is happening, and yes, we kind of should be worried. You've got this little sliver of grey, which is that disengaged group, and that group is really small now. And that group is disengaged, I think, from civic life more generally. Perhaps they're so busy just making ends meet and living that they're just disengaged from the topic and other topics as well to a certain extent. Then we have the doubtful group. So they're fence sitters again, but leaning towards no, I don't think it's really happening, or I don't think it's as important, etc. And as I mentioned, that dismissive. And over time, that alarmed segment is growing. We've seen it increasing quite dramatically in recent years. And that dismissive segment sits there at about the same. And it's sitting there at around that same kind of 10%. So when we first looked at these, we go, oh yeah, 10%, skeptical, that's just, it's probably the same people. So climate change dismissive, they're the people who are absolutely firm in their belief that climate change is not something we need to be worried about. It's either not happening or it's not a problem. We just, it's a waste of space. Stop talking about it, move on. They're often vocal, which leads people to overestimate how many of them there are. And, with that media false balance kind of approach, we tended to see people again thinking there were more of them than there really were. Okay, so when we looked at these 2 charts and we saw that dismissive segment was about 10%, we kind of thought, oh yeah, that's probably the same people. But when we brought them together, we found that was absolutely not the case, and we were really, really surprised. So what I'll do is I'll show you.
Yeah, I suppose you would assume that they're just deniers or skeptics across the board, but that's not what you found.
No. And that dismissive segment on the climate change segments, that's been followed over time, and it sits between 5 and 10%. Whenever it's been measured in Australia, it's between 5 and 10%. This particular sampling was one of the lowest we've seen, which was pretty amazing. And it's similar kind of rating. That 10% mark seems to be a kind of a standard. We've seen it in the UK and the US as well. That kind of sits there in those kinds of communities. So if we when we put those together, though, we see something quite different. And so these tables here, the shaded cells, what we did was we looked at the rows. So the climate change alarmed segment, we looked at which of the COVID vaccine segments has the biggest number of people in it. So in that alarmed segment, for men, the largest segment was that enthusiast segment. Same in the women. But you see the pattern across the rest of the segments is actually quite different. So the women were much more skeptical of the vaccines than men. but it has that interesting U shape. So you can see people that are kind of uncertain, kind of in that more fence sitters space, were also more fence sitters, a bit more hesitant, a bit more skeptical in that kind of space for COVID. So we got this weird shape that we just weren't expecting. So people who were dismissive of climate change were actually some of the most enthusiastic, particularly for the men. They were enthusiasts. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment, but just wanted to start there. So women tended to be more hesitant of the vaccines than men. Women were less likely to be skeptical on climate change, though.
See, can I just interrupt for a sec, because there's a question that's come through, and before you go on, you might be able to answer this. It says, could you please define climate change dismissive? Is it dismissive that climate change is happening at all, or is it dismissive that humans are causing or contributing to climate change?
It's not restricted to people who think it's not human caused. We get people in the concerned category who don't recognise that humans are the cause. So around about 25% of the Australian population think that climate change has natural causes. So about 25% still think that, even though it's only like 5 to 10% think that it's not happening. And those people who think it's natural are often in those central cautious doubtful, or in that concerned even segment. So they can be quite worried about that climate change is happening and it's causing all these impacts, but not necessarily recognise that it's our fault and that we need to do something about it. And that's a particularly problematic view if you're talking about mitigation and preventing emissions.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is what we found. So we found that unusual shape that we weren't expecting, because we really did expect that if you were skeptical on one thing, you'd be skeptical on the other, and that's not what we found. And we thought that possibly this is due to people's risk profile. So in general, we are generalising here, men tend to be less risk averse than women. So women tend to be more risk averse than men. And I'll talk about age in a minute. And one of the other aspects that we need to think about with regard to risk is whether or not somebody viewed the risk of COVID as more than the risk of the vaccine. So if you didn't think you were at particular risk from COVID, then that may not counteract the level of risk that you might see to the vaccine. And some of this happened around the time when the vaccines were getting a really bad rep in the media around some of the risks that they posed. And so some of this hesitancy is likely due to the confusion around those other aspects, and whether or not the vaccines were more risk than getting COVID. So with regard to age, I haven't got a specific chart for that because there's multiple age groups, but I will go on to it a little bit later.
Lucy, just before you go on to age, did you have any hypotheses about why women might be more risk averse than men?
Somewhat. So partly, as I said, around that just the inherent tendencies towards being more risk averse. I think that there was some slight skew in that the women in the sample were slightly younger and the men were slightly older in our sample. And that's, I think, partly also where some of this might come in. So younger people tended to be more skeptical of the vaccines than older people. And as I said, when this survey was done, this was at a time when the young people were being told, you're not at risk. Old people are the ones at risk. So this was still relatively early on in the process. And so, and the vaccines had only been released for older people and those, as I said, who are, had compromised health. So young people, it just wasn't really a risk. COVID wasn't a risk to them. So, why would I need to get a vaccine? It's not important. So that kind of aspect comes in there. And in contrast, very few young people are skeptical when it comes to climate change. So with a slight skew in young women and slightly older men, that interaction, I think, comes into play here a little bit as well. In that regard.
So could it be also that getting the vaccine is something very immediate, whereas climate change is not only increasing, but is going to have its worst effects in the future?
Yes.
So younger people might be more worried about what's going to happen when they're older and less worried about what an immediate vaccine, whereas the older people are more worried about their immediate health and
Correct.
therefore wanting to get vaccine, whereas climate change is something which is way off in the future and they may not be around at that stage.
Yes,
something
that's
like
true.
that.
Yes, absolutely. And we also have the fact that climate change has been on the agenda, it's been in the news and in people's minds for a lot longer time. So from that perspective as well, there's the uncertainty around even understanding, COVID and what risks it really plays and that sort of, confusion aspect there. And when you add in the complexities of how the politicians treated the issue, how they gave voice to the science or not, how they misrepresented the science. Most people's experience of science is mediated. It comes through a politician's voice on the news or a journalist's interpretation of the science. And so when we're getting those skewed messages, it can be quite difficult for people to be confident in what's happening and in what they should be doing. We also looked at people's political views and how that intersected with these. And what we found that it was interesting to me, people who were classed themselves as liberals or conservatives were actually more accepting of the vaccines than people who were politically moderate. And generally to the same extent, which I found really interesting. And part of that, I think, may be, again, due to the women and men and age aspects. So if you've got, for example, if you have, and I'll show you some interaction charts on that. I might jump over to the interaction charts. So except for that that climate change cautious segment, liberals in that segment were actually more supportive than conservatives. So just in that central space, we saw a bit of difference there. And I do have a theory about that as well. So if you think about it in terms of, like, as I was saying before, that people in the middle tend to be a little less confident in their views of the science. And you think about people on a political spectrum, people who are in the middle, put themselves in the middle there, may also not be as decisive. It's like and more maneuverable and flexible in that sort of central space. And so, if that's the case, then that kind of makes sense. They're a bit more hesitant in general. And so it may be that that's a case. We haven't tested that, but that is one hypothesis that we came up with that might explain some of these things. And so I'll just show you this. Hang on, let me just get myself a little bit out of the way here. So as you can see here, this is a chart that shows just for that concerned climate change segment. So that was the segment that had the largest number of people. So in terms of getting enough data for statistical testing, we just pulled out that segment. And you can see here that this is comparing men and women against that political identity split. And you can see here that we do see the same difference between men and women for each of those different sections, different political identities. So they're quite different. Men having a larger enthusiast segment and women having a smaller enthusiast segment. But what you can see again is that moderate is lower again, less so for the men than it is for the women. So similar to that more defined V shape we saw in the women's chart, we can see again here a more defined split in terms of over that liberal, moderate, conservative. So that I found that quite interesting that they do intersect. So if you're already hesitant, or potentially, if you're already more hesitant or less confident in that, this is definitely how I feel from a liberal conservative's viewpoint, and you're also then more hesitant with regards to, are the vaccines worthwhile or not? Should I be, shouldn't I be? So in that regard, it kind of makes some sense. And when we look at the age groups, we see again that dramatic difference between those who are over 50 and those in the younger two age groups there, which were much closer in their distribution of that enthusiast sort of space. But we do see that same V. So people who are politically moderate tend to have less enthusiasm in comparison to the two ends of that spectrum.
So would they be sort of classified as just being undecided? Either they don't feel as though they have enough information to be able to have an opinion one way or the other, or are they more disengaged from receiving information so that they can make an opinion?
Well, the way the questions were asked in the COVID space, it was asking questions such as, my doctor thinks I should get a vaccine. So that's one social norm. My family and friends think I should get a vaccine. From that perspective, it wasn't necessarily about how they viewed the vaccine in its entirety. It wasn't just their attitudes towards the vaccine, it was the whole spectrum. Their intentions to get the vaccine and why were a part of that, but they weren't the entirety of that. So it brought in those other aspects. So whether or not they perceived social expectations that they would, whether or not they felt they had control. So that kind of suite of things come into that, and whether or not they were likely to get that vaccine plays into that. And so we were trying to understand why. So when they said, no, I won't get the vaccine, it's, well, yeah, actually that relates to the fact that they don't see any social pressure for it. They don't see, their GP isn't telling them they need to get it. All these kinds of factors in the background that contribute to people's intentions, their attitudes, to get that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
So from that perspective, sort of thinking about why, and it, in our heads, it's like kind of a combination of risk perceptions and people in those kinds of attitude space. So people's inherent individual characteristics. So, if you don't have confidence, in your understanding of the science and your, this is definitely what we need to do. This is the approach we need to have. We all need to be out there getting vaccines. If you're not confident in that space, you're not confident in your understanding of those aspects, then that's one aspect. Your risk. So if you're have an inherent hesitancy, and the marketing is the other aspect. So the way COVID and the risks of COVID were marketed to certain age groups initially was a factor, and the way that the vaccines risks were marketed in that media space as well was also another factor in there. One thing I would like to highlight too, which I think is quite interesting when you see it in this context, there's some research that's shown that people who self-identify as politically conservative have a physically stronger startle reflex. So that's the kind of response, physically stronger startle reflex than people who self-identify as liberal, politically liberal. So the world is actually physically a scarier space for them. So if you think about it in that context, then the risks that those people are identifying might be different to the risks that someone who is more liberal is recognizing. But those risks may still be propelling them towards the same outcome. So while someone who might be liberal, they might not be concerned for their own health, but they might be socially concerned, and so they end up in that social kind of category. That might lead them to that same space, whereas someone who is conservative might end up in that same space via a different route. Might be about their personal risk or the risk to their spouse or what have you. So, in that context, different perceptions of different risks can still lead to that same outcome in terms of their final behaviour intent to take up that vaccine. So from a messaging perspective, the understanding these segments and some of those things that drive people to be in these segments and, to put forward these attitudes that no, climate change isn't something we need to worry about, or no, we shouldn't be getting the vaccines. So putting forward those kinds of attitudes in that public space, understanding some of those drivers, some of those social and personal drivers, understanding what drives that hesitancy, that perception of risk, that the vaccines are more a risk than COVID. Understanding those differences can help us actually tailor the messages to tap into those aspects in terms of trying to encourage uptake of those kinds of behaviours and necessary actions there. And so it's not necessarily just about presenting more facts. Facts don't convince people. People will tap into and cherry pick the facts that support their own opinions. Facts don't always make the difference. Sometimes they can. It depends on why people have chosen the stance they have, and whether or not that's actually, as your society says, if it's a rationalist decision or it's a more heuristic decision that they then reinforce by cherry-picked information. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, and sometimes it can be difficult to know which is which until you're in that conversation. That can be difficult. So, yeah, helping us understand the kind of motivations behind it, how those, and it's particularly important for politically controversial issues, which COVID has became. It might not have been originally, but it became that. It became that war zone, just like climate has. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about with that research. Happy to answer any questions that you might have now.
Lucy, thank you. It's just fascinating and such a sort of counterintuitive outcome, where you sort of think that skeptical people are skeptical people and they're going to be skeptical across a whole lot of topics, and yet what you said is not true. And also the differences, male versus female, I mean, that would be, surely there's a sociologist who would love to do a PhD thesis on why that might be the case. But thank you for that. We do have some questions, but I just want to start off with one that just occurred to me when you were talking about the startle response. I haven't heard it referred to like that before, but you then said that the Conservatives who have a sort of higher, or is it a more quick startle response? Is that
Stronger.
A stronger startle response? And that for them, the world is a scarier place. Yeah. And if I think about young people coming through, where they're exposed to a lot of the, let's say, quote unquote, alarmist messaging about climate change, that for them, the world is, I mean, in reality, a scarier place. Could we then make the link that young people might become more conservative? Or is it, or does the cause and effect not go the other way?
We don't know. So the research hasn't necessarily worked out chicken and egg. Are they conservative because of the startle reflex, or is the startle reflex because they're conservative? Right. So we don't really know the directionality. And if you think about it too, it's also potentially there's that socialization aspect. So many young people these days are worried about climate change. And for them, it's almost a social expectation. If you're young, you should be worried. So from that perspective, which isn't necessarily to say which policies they might support. So yes, we will have young people who are conservative. That's just the way that humans are. So that may play out in which kinds of responses they think are appropriate, as opposed to whether or not we need to act. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'm not worried that the youth will try and turn climate action on its ear because they're conservative. I don't think that's going to be the case. We have conservative people, politically conservative people, who are absolutely encouraging action. They desperately want it. It's not necessarily as bipartisan as it's made out to be. As bipolar. It is
polarized.
It's not as polarized as it's often made out to be. There's a lot more convergence these days, I think, as we're seeing more and more impact here in Australia.
If I might turn to the questions that have been sent in beforehand and go through those. The first question is from Brian Morris, and he asks, what proportion of climate deniers, or I suppose you would call them dismissives, do you think are devoutly religious, given that this cohort believe Armageddon is imminent and concerns for a climate crisis are really futile?
That's not necessarily the case. We actually get, so most of the dismissives are not, most of them are not considering that it's a really, they don't see it as Armageddon. They actually tend to be the people who just dismiss it. It's like, no, you're an idiot. Just, it's not happening. Just move away. So they're the ones who are completely skeptical as such. Whereas the people who are worried that it's going to happen and we can't do anything, sometimes they're within those that they're within that alarm segment. So it's just, it's just more of a smaller component in there who are. And we see people moving in and out of that space. There are days when I fit in that space, and there are days when I don't. I don't think I think that's a bit more fluid.
Did you have any data about the sort of religiosity of your respondents?
Yes. Well, we did have it in here, and we have seen it in some other studies. When it comes to religion, people who, so the data we had, we didn't have sufficient numbers of the minor religions to support analysis, but we had a large enough sample of pooled Christian religious people that we could compare Christians versus non-religious individuals. And we found that as a general trend, people who followed the Christian religion were less concerned about climate change than people who didn't follow a religion. But it's not a strong across the board kind of thing. So there'd be some people in there who may have the sort of religious attitude that it doesn't matter what we do, God's going to do whatever they want, or that God will save us. So that sort of superhuman power, and for some people, maybe that's Mother Nature. It's not necessarily just limited to those specific religions. But yes, there is a tendency to be less concerned for whatever reason. But again, there are some religions in there, some people in some religions who are absolutely get in there and get dirty and help solve this. So it's not across the board, but there is that general tendency that you can see in terms of averaging across the data.
Okay. There's another question here from Roberto, who said, this is beauty. How do you respond when people presumably are making comments on social media, for example? How do you respond when they reply, I've done my research and found that COVID vaccines are killing people?
That's a fun one. There are people, and that seems to be a prime example, where facts have absolutely nothing to do with them and their decision-making process. When they have something they want, an opinion they have, people can find data to support that. I have a relative who absolutely fits in that category, and we no longer have conversations around COVID. It's just not a conversation we have, because it wouldn't matter how many times I bang my head against the wall, we will disagree. Facts won't change that. And that's why that, for example, that dismissive segment in climate change tends to stay around about that same kind of percentage. It sort of sits in a very close percentage. They're hardcore, like that's just it. They're not going to change their mind. When it comes to message targeting, they're not the people we target anymore. We just ignore them and we focus on the people who are uncertain. because they're the ones who are more flexible and are more open to receiving new information. So from that perspective, it's not worth trying. It's not worth hurting yourself over it.
So right off 10%, 10 in 100, just don't even bother. Just walk away.
Yeah. And, maybe they'll change their mind over time. Maybe they will eventually, be dragged along because, you get to the point where what else can you do? That some of the impacts we're seeing now and the in climate change specifically, the skepticism that the techniques, that the rhetoric that's being used now has shifted. So there's the amount of arguments that are being put out there now that climate change isn't happening has dropped off dramatically. Like in from that context, it's like they've started to see that you can't just deny that it's happening anymore. So the argument is shifting. So now the argument is about, okay, it might be happening, but, it's not, we didn't cause it. Or, yeah, okay, it might be happening, but that solution won't work. It's too expensive. It's too this, it's too that. It's, or you're overstating the, significance. Or so the rhetoric is shifting, but they're still sitting in that little 10%, 5 to 10% are still sitting there arguing that we shouldn't be taking action. But their argument has shifted now, if that makes sense. Worryingly, but.
If we can just go back to the politics for a little bit. At the last federal election, it was in 2022, it was really clear that climate change was a very high priority for most voters. And of course, that led to the wave of teal MPs being elected. But that wasn't reproduced at the state elections. So there were teal candidates in the state elections, and they also had climate change as one of their top priorities, but they were not as successful. Now, even if you have a personal view, why was that the case? Is it?
I have a few hypotheses on that.
Please.
So one of the things that we've seen in terms of attitudes to climate change over time is that when the government is doing well, people's concern drops off. When the government is not doing well, the concern lifts. So, for example, when the Paris Agreement came into place, all of a sudden concern dropped off. It was like everybody said, "Oh, phew, that's sorted." If people had thought that at the federal level it's sorted, they might have made the assumption that that will trickle down and the states are therefore sorted. There's also the aspect that when you come down to that more local scale, there may be differences. So, for example, within Queensland, you might have larger pockets of, mineral-rich country that are heavily economically dependent and socially dependent upon those kind of industries. And so, in those areas, you might not see it as much, but at that federal level, it aggregates to that space, if that makes sense. So even though you might have got a federal teal member in those areas, that was when people were thinking at a federal level. When they're thinking at a local, they're in their state, you might see differences.
Interesting.
That's my hypothesis. As I said, I haven't studied that, but they would be my two. Yeah.
And just thinking about this denialism in the context of the Indigenous voice to Parliament, it seems to me that it's always that it is relatively easier to counter something or undermine something using fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the FUD tactic. And we've seen this in the No campaign against the voice. Is there, from your studies of environmental science and communication, social psychology, is there a positive aspect of fear, uncertainty, and doubt? In other words, is there a set of tools to effectively communicate positive change in the same way that's sort of equal and opposite to the fear, uncertainty, and doubt set of tools to undermine or to counter change.
Historically, what we've seen is it's way easier to obfuscate and confuse. And when people are confused, that's when the ball gets dropped. It's much easier to tear something down than it is to build it up. Having said that, it takes a lot of concerted effort from multiple angles to address that kind of thing. And we don't seem to have strong leadership in that space. There's not as much cohesion. Even within the pro-climate political space, it's independence and a moderate government. Do you know what I mean? So they're not really pushing that consistent messaging, and it takes consistency to overcome that obfuscation, that confusion. And we just don't see that. And it's been that way for a long time. The Conservative governments that have wanted to push an anti-climate agenda have been very, very good at leading the language. So even the proponents of the legislation started calling it a carbon tax. Once you right. adopt that and you accept that as the common terminology, yep. You've totally lost people. They're very good at leading the language there, and once that happens, it's very difficult to claw that back. And so from that perspective, even those simple language tweaks can be very effective strategies.
Having said that, and I want to come back, Mohan has put in a question, and I want to come back to that question, but the word marketing specialists, you talked about segmentation before, and there's a whole science around in marketing and advertising about segmentation and targeting different messages to different parts of the market. In science communication and sort of understanding the market segmentation as you've just described, could that not lead to carefully shaped but differing messages for each of those market segmentations that you've described?
Yes, it can. The difficulty is delivering them. So one of the things that we use the audience segmentation for is actually to assess unintended consequences. Because when you tailor messages to a specific segment and they go out into the public space, there are very few channels where you only hit the people you're targeting. Most of the time, and we've done studies looking at, where do those segments go for their news? And pretty much every news space has people across the whole spectrum.
Well,
so if you're targeting
Facebook,
people,
surely.
Sorry?
Except for Facebook.
And Sky. In most cases, unless you're paying for your, targeted marketing on Facebook, you're still going to hit people across the full spectrum. And so one of the things that we've been using it for is actually testing messages to see where there's rebound effects or unintended consequences. And so, for example, what is a good example? Using a message that's in local context works for every segment. People are concerned about what's happening near them. So when you're talking about climate change and its impacts, linking that global to the local, people are concerned about their local. So that works for across every segment. If you're talking about climate change adaptation messages, if you don't need to use the word climate change, don't use it, because you're going to put off people who would undertake that behaviour because it's necessary to deal with whatever impacts are happening.
That's really interesting. So sometimes it might be better, even if you are concerned about climate change, not to use that terminology, so you don't sort of trigger the defensive response, because somebody else may have already identified with the other side.
We also did a study. Testing messages around renewable energy. And so we tested all these messages, and across the board, everybody thought Yes, renewable energy is great. We should be exporting renewable energy. It's going to happen, sometime. But as soon as you include messaging that mentions both renewable energy and fossil fuels, you trigger this political polarization. If you don't mention fossil fuels, everybody thinks it's wonderful. So it's like that heuristic connection that triggers that defensive, like, oh no, so it's an interesting space, the use of language.
So anything that might trigger the unconscious membership of a particular tribe,
yes,
you want to avoid that.
Yes. And people can be supportive of a new industry, but not necessarily want their old industry taken away, if that makes sense. So if you're not pitting them against each other, it's okay.
Yes. Mohan had a question, and I'm not sure if Mohan's with us because I'm not sure that I understand.
I can see Mohan on the screen. Well, Mohan's name.
Oh, yes. I'm going to ask him to unmute. Anyway, his question is, and Mohan, we may need to get some clarification from you. His question is, in the context of the COVID virus, which seems to have outwitted, well, I'm not sure this is true actually, but he says outwitted our best health professionals. He asks the question, does that mean that the scientific method is an invention, that is, it's a man-made invention, or is it always there and it was discovered? I mean, you might want to just make a comment generally about the scientific method. Do you think the scientific method is something that humans have invented, or do you think that it's something that sort of existed and humans have discovered that it's a useful method?
Yeah, so I think an interesting thing to think about here, I don't know if you've ever watched a toddler, but a toddler uses the scientific method to learn about their world. They actually test what happens when I do this, what happens when I do that, if I do it differently, what happens. So they're learning in that way without recognizing that that's what it is. They understand physics at a phenomenally young age. It's astounding how their brains work and how they learn about the world. And so, to some extent, it's inherent in us to do this. Our Indigenous cultures did this. They just didn't call it that. And they didn't formalize it in the way that we do it now. And so I'm not sure that it's even, I wouldn't class it as an invention because it's, I see it as quite inherent in who we are. We don't always do it well when it's not formalized. That's how we get our mistaken assumptions and patterns and things. But it is built in to some extent for us to test our hypotheses around the world and how things happen. We just, like I said, don't necessarily do it well. So I'm not sure that I would class it as an invention. I don't know if that answers Mohan's question, though. Was that what you were intending, Mohan? Yeah?
Yeah, he's got a thumbs up.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mohan. Look, we're getting towards the end of the hour, but I just wanted to maybe draw you out on some broader research that you've been doing. I understand that you've been involved in a program called the Global Challenges Program. Do you want to just talk to us a little bit about that and what your role has been?
Sure. So our science faculty have a degree for undergraduate students, which is the Global Challenges Program. It's their highest achieving science students, and it's kind of an extension program where they get to do new things. And one of the units they do is actually a project with an industry partner, and so we've actually been that industry partner working with students on projects, and they kind of do it's like a consultancy project. And so one of the project I've got on with the students this semester is that it's actually an extension of this COVID climate change project, where they're taking the second wave of survey data that we had, and they're in that one, we actually ask people about their attitudes towards science in general. So what role science should play in society. And so what they're doing is they're actually looking at people's experiences around COVID and around climate change. And they're bringing those together with the attitudes to those issues and the attitudes in general towards science to see how does that predict people's attitudes towards policy. So do their general science attitudes and their experiences, how do they predict their attitudes towards the issue? And how do those then predict attitudes towards policy decisions? And so that's kind of an extension project where they're trying to see, does it actually relate to those underlying attitudes and experiences, and how does that actually come into play in the differences that we might be seeing, such as in this study I talked about.
And these people are what sort of age?
Third year science students.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So still fairly young.
Learning.
Yeah. Just finally, there's quite a bit of concern that young people per se, and maybe not young adults, but certainly teenagers, school students, are becoming quite anxious about climate change. And do you have a view about whether or not some of the messaging around the risks of climate change, the effects of climate change, and how that people ought to be really alarmed about it, some people think that that's maybe unnecessarily harming the next generation's sense of well-being and optimism about the future. So, is there a sort of a downside to this very strong messaging about climate change?
Yes and no. So there is the concept of eco-anxiety. So that worry about the future of our environment and what that means for us and our world. And there is what they call eustress, which is the positive stresses that actually they motivate action, and then distress, which tips us over into that overwhelm and causes us to disengage. Some of the research that's looked at young people, particularly even children, has actually found that there are a range of different aspects that can help buffer those young people. So one is having trust in their elders. So do they trust that action will be taken? And for many of our young people, that trust isn't necessarily there. So making sure that the message is getting out where action is happening. So there is a lot of action happening. It might not be enough yet, but there is a lot of momentum. And so making sure that people are aware of that momentum, we're not very good at that yet. So making sure that's the case. Having a sense of agency, so actually being able to act. So giving them some opportunities to take ownership and to actually act within their family, within their home, within their school. Those kinds of things can be really beneficial. The best practice around climate change messaging is actually, yes, there is a certain amount of fear and sort of negative emotional content that is necessary and can't really be avoided, but it always needs to be balanced with messaging of hope and with actionable, that, like I said, agency. So giving people agency. Just being worried doesn't get you anywhere. It's just becomes debilitating. But being worried and knowing you can do this, that, or the other, that's when it becomes agentic, and you can actually mitigate or buffer against that fear, if that makes sense.
The old call to action.
Yes.
Is important.
Yes. But not just a generic call to action, but actually, more specific. You can actually do this, that, or the other, and this thing would be most beneficial, and kind of giving them that really useful, practical advice that's relevant to their age group. Needs to be something they can actually do, and that's often not where it is. They don't necessarily understand or be given that agency at that young age.
Lucy, you've given us lots to think about. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. It's sort of a deep dive, but also quite broad as well in the end. And it's really comforting to know that there are people like you who have this deeper understanding and a very articulate way of explaining it to everybody. And it's not just you, you're working with colleagues about science communication and honing the messaging and hopefully building this set of tools that we can get across the sense of agency about doing something about it, so that we don't just fall into despair and say, oh, it's all too hard.
Yes.
So look, on behalf of everybody here and the people who've sent in questions and so on, can I thank you very, very much. That's been absolutely fascinating and fantastic, and all power to your arm. Go for it. Terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everybody else who's joined us tonight. As usual, we will put the video up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days, and we'll let people know when that's ready. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and hope to see you at the next RSA webinar. For now, good night.